will start with kind of our final thoughts for concluding the class. I have just a few things. I was reflecting yesterday on, if anything, what would be the key takeaways that I would want you all to have from this class. So that's the question that I posed, was what are some of the key takeaways, some things that we have highlighted or emphasized that I would like for us to hold on to moving forward. So this is posed as a question just for you all to think about. And so then I kind of answer the question for myself of what my goal is or was for this class, of what I hoped you all would take away. So you all can think about it yourselves. But this would be what my hope is for you all. So the main thing that I wanted to catch was why it's important for us to be reading the Old Testament. Why it's important for us to be reading the Torah in particular. I think a lot of us tend to read the New Testament out of love and read the Old Testament out of obligation, right? Where when we sit down to read devotionally, we want to read cute stories about Jesus doing nice things for people. Or we want to read, rich theological things from Paul, or whatever it is. New Testament stuff, we want Jesus. And we tend to feel more obligatory, begrudging to read Old Testament text. Does anybody, you see what I'm getting at here? So I wanted to highlight things that I think have come to the surface in our discussions and in our readings of why it's important for us to maintain reading the Old Testament. So, a couple of answers that I came up with. First, we see the grander picture of the character of God as well as the story of redemption. When we focus only on Jesus in the New Testament, we tend to miss aspects of God that are demonstrated or clarified, revealed in Old Testament text. I think we've been talking about them, especially in these paper presentations, of God's holiness and keen sense of justice. We tend to miss over that if we just focus on Jesus the whole time and focus on forgiving sin. Then if that's the only emphasis, then we forget God's true hatred of sin, right? These are the sorts of things that when reading the Old Testament as part of your devotional life, you are reminded of the totality of God's character, as well as the totality of the story of redemption, where it's not just Jesus dying on the cross. It's everything that leads up to that. And the mechanisms, the history that God goes through and orchestrates in order to get us there, right? The way that God interacts with his people for thousands of years prior to Jesus being on the cross. And we need to have that centralized in our mind in order to truly understand what's going on when we read the New Testament. Good? So that's my first thought. Second, I really think I personally have benefited from the way that we've been going through this class, and at my church, we're going through the Gospel of John in my Sunday school. And I have benefited from reading both of these texts in light of each other, and really diving into Leviticus while I'm also diving into John 4. This has popped up over and over where, because we started the classes around the same time, we're reading John 1 at the same time we're reading Genesis 1, right? And we all know that that's how we're supposed to be reading them, right? But there have been other things that have popped up that have really, because of the emphasis that we've had reading Torah in this class, it has helped me see things in John that I might not have seen before. So the lesson that we had this last Sunday in Sunday school was on John 7 and 8. And the whole context of 7, 8, 9, and 10 in John is focused on the Festival of Booths, Tabernacles. And I tend to read that and say, okay, it's a festival. And then I kind of move on and don't focus on anything else that it's a festival, they're in Jerusalem, that's all I need to know. But reading through, studying that text after having studied Exodus and Numbers, we realize what's going on in the Festival of Tabernacles. It's the most important, it's one of the 3 required festivals where Jewish men have to go to Jerusalem to participate. It's an 8-day festival, and by the time Jesus is on the scene, it's the most popular. The most people come for this festival compared to, more people come for this than for Passover. And the festival is centered around 2 big ceremonial events that are designed to reflect and to remember 2 events from Torah. God acting as a pillar of fire to lead the Israelites in the wilderness, and God, through Moses, drawing water from the rock. And so in the festival itself, there's a ceremonial water pouring where they ritually draw water and pour it out in remembrance of God pouring water out of the rock. And they have a ceremonial lamp lighting to remember God's pillar of fire. I think Josephus writes about it and describes how there's so much light coming from the courtyard in the temple that every porch in Jerusalem is illuminated. It's probably metaphorical, but that's the amount of light that it's talking about. It's this huge, significant, light and water are huge aspects of what's going on. And then we read, so that's like verse 1 in chapter 7 of John, this is the festival that we're talking about. And then there's 2 instances where it says that Jesus comes on the scene during the festival and makes these announcements. What are the 2 big things that Jesus claims to be in 7 and 8? He comes out during the high day of the festival when they're doing the ceremonial water pouring, and he comes out and says, if anyone thirsts, come to me. Right? So because we have spent our time reading this in the Old Testament, and we know what's going on, and we know the significance of the people are grumbling in the desert because they don't have water, and God provides for them. And now Jesus comes on the scene and says, if anybody's thirsty, come and see me about it. Right? Jesus is identifying himself as the water that's coming out of the rock. And we miss that. If we're not living in the Old Testament devotionally, we miss those sort of things. The next thing that happens is the ceremonial lamp lighting, where all of Jerusalem is illuminated by this. And Jesus comes on the scene and proclaims to the crowd what? I am the light of the world. Right? All of this, as bright as it is, it's all a metaphor for me. Right? When God provided fire in the desert to lead everybody, that was me. Right? I am the reality that all of that represented. Right? And that, we miss all of that if we're not living in reading the Old Testament devotionally, even reading Torah devotionally. Right? So much of what we see in the New Testament assumes a thorough and fundamental knowledge of the Old Testament. What I always like to talk about is the way that Matthew designs his gospel. Matthew is always trying to argue that Jesus is a new and better version of folks that we have read in the Old Testament. So Matthew has Jesus coming onto the scene and being baptized, right? In the same way that the Israelites come through the Red Sea, parting the Red Sea. And then, right after his baptism, Jesus is kind of whisked away to be tempted in the desert by Satan, in the same way that the Israelites are tempted in the wilderness, right? And so this is Matthew 4 and Matthew 3 and Matthew 4. And then, the way that Matthew describes it, Jesus ascends a mountain to give his Sermon on the Mount. He ascends the mountain and gives a law. In the same way that Moses ascends Sinai and receives a law, right? So the way that Matthew is crafting it, we're supposed to think of Jesus as a new and better Israel, right? The fulfillment of Israel, and a new and better Moses, a lawgiver who gives law on his own authority and not having to go to God for the authority, right? Matthew has things like, Matthew alone tells us, why is it that Joseph ends up deciding he could marry Mary? How is it that Joseph is spoken to in Matthew?
Doesn't an angel come to him in a dream?
An angel comes to him in a dream. So Matthew starts off with this story of a man named Joseph who's dreaming dreams. And the dreams that he's dreaming lead him where? into Egypt, right? This is exactly Genesis, right? Joseph starts dreaming dreams, and because he's operating in this way, because he's dreaming prophetic dreams, it leads him into Egypt, right? And we miss that entirely, that Matthew is trying to tell us things about Jesus based on our knowledge of the Old Testament. Good? This is the kind of stuff that I really enjoy. And being deep in the Old Testament keeps this sort of stuff fresh in our minds so that we can understand what the authors are trying to tell us when we're reading the New Testament, what they're trying to tell us about Jesus. And then the last thing, I think it really does help our witness. It helps our ability to engage with non-believers if we study and we read and we love the stuff that we see in the Old Testament. I think that a lot of us operate with kind of like shame, and we try to tell people about Jesus and we feel a little ashamed of the Old Testament, right? We say, oh, let's talk about Jesus. Let's not talk about all the weird stuff that happens in the Old Testament. Let's not talk about the laws and the stoning people and all that sort of stuff. Let's not talk about that. This is the stuff that I'm proud of. I'm proud of the stuff that I see at the end of the Gospels when Jesus dies on the cross. And I don't really want to talk about the other stuff, right? And if we're claiming that the Bible is the authority of our lives, then we can't act as though we're ashamed of the majority of it, right? The Old Testament. And when we spend time like we have diving into it, it helps us not just to read it out of obedience, but to read it out of love. And to love the things that we're seeing in it. And not operate in a way that we're ashamed of these things that are weird stories, right? This goes back to what we talked about weeks ago of not appearing hypocritical. When we're engaging with other people and talking about laws that we uphold or laws that we reject from the Old Testament, having a mechanism, having a framework to actually navigate that so that we don't appear hypocritical. Because hypocrisy will destroy our witness, right? And if we don't spend our time reading and studying and loving the Old Testament, then we lose that ability to have a framework so that we can avoid appearing hypocritical. Does all this make sense? So these are kind of my three main takeaways that I would want us to walk away from this class of the importance of reading the Old Testament regularly as part of our devotional lives. We're reading through the Bible in a year, so we're spending time most of the year in the Old Testament. I don't know about you all. I find most sermons that I listen to, most sermons that I see at church, they come from the New Testament, right? They're preaching through New Testament texts, or hey, we're going to have a sermon about this topic, and we're pulling New Testament text from it. So if we're not reading the Old Testament devotionally as part of our regular habits, then we really don't get it. We really don't get those stories as part of our curriculum, in our own minds, in our own spirits. So those are my three takeaways. That we get more of the character of God, that the New Testament comes alive when we have the foundation of the Old Testament, and that it increases our ability to witness to others when we read and study and love the Old Testament. So those are the three things that I hope you all would take from this class. I'm curious if you all have your own takeaways or things that have been highlights or things that you have remembered from this class. I'm curious to hear what you all think.